Welcome to How to Be a Supervisor, sponsored by the ABA Career Center. Moderating the program today is Kathy Morris. Kathy is founder of Under Advisement Limited and former Director of Career Counseling and Placement for Northwestern University School of Law, former Director of the ABA Career Resource Center and the Center for Continuing Legal Education. She has decades of experience with guiding law students, lawyers, and law firms, focusing on attorney training and professional development. Kathy, you may proceed with the program.
Thanks, Rebecca. And also want to thank our ABA sponsor, the Career Center, which has a website you see on the slide. It's a place where you can upload your resume or receive alerts or about jobs or post a job. And I want to introduce to you our two really wonderful faculty members today. You have a slide that goes into a little more detail, but Sue Manch has been a veteran in helping lawyers improve their practice and management competencies for many years, and she founded her own company and is now a partner, having been in between with a law firm in Washington overseeing the professional development, and will now be heading to do that out in Texas, which is exciting. We can't have enough good people in the field, and Sue's one of the best. And Mike has been a practicing lawyer as a partner at Latham, and then was a general counsel in-house for Safeway, and also has a consulting relationship, I should say, with Altman Weil. And he's a prolific speaker and teacher, as is Sue, and we're really very, very lucky to have them both with us today. Thank you both. Welcome, Sue and Mike.
Thank you, Kathy.
What we're going to do, as we always do if you've been on the program with us before, is go over some of our top issues and then get to a point where we give quick tips, where we take your questions throughout. So if you have them, send them on, and I'll take them as I can. We get to a moment that I call agree-disagree, which is where I throw out a concept and the speakers will either agree, disagree, and say why. And again, more questions, and then we leave you with some takeaways and resources, things you continue to think about and do after the program. So the issues we want to discuss in becoming what I call a superior supervisor really is starting, I think, with the thing that kicks off the supervision, which is really delegation. And I'd like you each to say a few words about the first steps in delegating, maybe even what you do before delegating. But Mike, how about you kicking us off on that?
Sure, Kathy, I'd be happy to. Having been the client, that is general counsel, for a good part of my career, I recommend a pre-delegation step. First, stop and decide how to staff a case or a deal, because that's so often a key to the cost and client service generally. Staffing decisions need to be a collaboration between outside and inside counsel and among counsel. There need to be clear divisions of responsibility among attorneys and between outside and inside counsel. Otherwise, there's a potential for very serious problems. The idea is to match the talents of lawyers to the particular tasks you're about to delegate.
That's great advice, Mike. And I think even if you only have one person that you delegate to on a regular basis, the first rule is to make sure you're thinking about how you can make that person successful with the project. So how much experience does that person have? How much direction will he or she need? What kind of assignments are in their wheelhouse, and what will be stretch assignments, so that you can maximize the value of that person's talent, but also his or her time. Really, as Mike's pointed out already, delegation is a strong client service skill.
And, I think what that suggests there is delegating without initial planning, using a one-size-fits-all approach. Those are some red flags to effective delegation. But what are some more of the mistakes that lawyers tend to make when delegating an assignment? Mike, why don't you take that again?
Okay, sure. I think many supervisors fail at the beginning to give the supervisee what I call the big picture in two ways. First, supervisors should provide the context for how the individual assignment fits into the overall engagement. That is, what does it mean in the litigation or the transaction? How does the task affect the value, the risks, and the non-economic factors that affect the client? And if you think you're too busy to do this, my guess is you'll be a lot busy later dealing with the mistakes. And second, another big picture idea is to communicate to the supervisee what you expect in the way of communications about the work.
So can you kind of elaborate on that second point a little bit for me?
Sure. For example, you could say to the person, go ahead, start the project. My door is open. Come ask me any questions anytime you want. That might be helpful, but it might be a bit too vague. I used to use, and I prefer the idea of, this is your project. If you need to consult with me with about the last 5 or 10% special issues, by all means, come see me.
That's interesting. Sue, what do you think about that?
Well, I think that's a really good point, and I think we know that especially junior lawyers want to feel like real lawyers, regardless of what they're doing. But there's also that sense of fear. I don't want to be thrown into the pool without any kind of a life raft. So we want to make sure that we're thinking about how can we help them get beyond the discrete and the routine and sometimes the mind-numbing parts of engagements to allow them to have enough freedom to learn from what they're doing and to continue to grow so they continue to be more valuable to you as a supervisor. So I think if we go back to my original advice about making sure that the way that you delegate and the way that you structure your supervisory approach matches the person's talent and the type of task they're doing, then I think you should also be thinking about how you use assignments and your delegation of those assignments to really help people grow. This is an opportunity for supervisors to really make their lives easier in the future. The more you use supervision and delegation as teaching tools, allow you to continue to grow the talent who are working with you and also to keep them motivated and engaged. And really, these are retention tools.
Yeah, that's so interesting because, often we just think assignment to assignment, task to task. And if we're thinking about sort of the business of our practice, even if we're not in a law firm or company, the efficiency, the effectiveness, it really does. I mean, I think it makes for a better workplace for the people you delegate and supervise as well as for you, which is, something we don't often think about in the press of the day. We don't have any questions yet. I was thinking we might have some about delegation, but what we've been talking about, I think, leads us pretty smoothly deeper into the real topic of supervision. And Sue, this notion that I like of supervision as a retention tool, can you elaborate?
Well, I think all of us have worked for people who make it really easy for us to do our jobs well, and we've worked for other people who make it harder for us to do well. And everyone's slightly different in terms of what they like, but I think the kinds of things that you hear junior lawyers and mid-level lawyers talk about in terms of finding the most difficult work circumstances are when they're micromanaged, when people are looking over their shoulder and nitpicking everything they do and rewriting everything they write. When they, there's a sense there that you don't have any chance to really, learn and do things in the way that you want to show your own talents. It's also the toughest supervisors are those people who don't ever give any positive feedback. Maybe they give a lot of criticism, but they don't give the kinds of positive reinforcement that help people understand what they do well. Of course, worst of all are supervisors who don't give any feedback. You can, or even supervisors who give only sort of vague praise about that was great, that was really helpful. But at the end of the day, the lawyer doesn't have any idea what they did well, or what specific ways they added value to an assignment or to a client's work. I think what happens is when you get supervisors who are inept and who don't follow best practices, you're likely to lose that associate, or the associates or the junior lawyers will vote with their feet, and they just won't work for that lawyer again. You'll start to see patterns of who do people seek assignments from, and they want to work with the people who will give them enough room to grow, who will give them good feedback that's constructive and developmental, and who will really help them manage the assignment in the way that's appropriate to the complexity of the work and to their own talent level.
Well, we have a question from the audience, and I was actually just thinking about making a point about this, but the question really asks it well, and the listener says, any advice for the lawyer in the first few years of practice? I think this goes across the board too, but in the first few years of practice where the support staff have decades of experience on the lawyer. So the issue is, what about delegating and supervising people who are not lawyers, but they're your legal assistant support staff and they're more senior than you are? Who has some tips and thoughts about that?
I actually just was working with a firm yesterday and was talking with a secretarial manager about this topic, and I think there's a couple of good kernels of advice in some of her suggestions to me, and one was to make sure that if there is a secretarial supervisor as a junior associate, you're checking in with that person to find out, what can I delegate? What should I delegate? What are my colleagues delegating? To make sure you know the full range of services that the support staff member is able to provide for you. And then sitting down and talking through those services with your secretary or with your legal assistant to say, here are all the things that they tell me that you can do for me, and I'd like to talk with you about how we might work through these services, because that way it's a third party telling you what they can do. It's not you saying, I want you to do A, B, C, D, and G. It's saying, I understand these are the ways we might work together, and let's talk through what's the best way.
It reminds me of when I was a junior officer in the Navy and reported aboard, and the chiefs all knew everything and I knew nothing. And I found the key was to show the administrative person, all the respect in the world for their experience, and make sure that they knew it was their job to help you look good.
I think that's really good advice. I think that on the other hand, you have to find the line, I think, and it takes a while, sort of being friendly and communicative and being friends, with the people you're trying to, delegate, supervise, and whatnot. And that's a line, just something to think about. We had another good question I want to move on to. How does one best deal with unhelpful micromanagement, either as a delegator or as a delegatee? So I think, Sue, you were mentioning, micromanagement, and let's say that's happening because a lot of lawyers, as supervisors, make that mistake. They just can't let go. What can you do as the person chafing under the weight of that, other than look for another job?
Well, I think it's a difficult situation, because there's really the only solution is for you to have a conversation with the person who's micromanaging you, which can be very awkward because it's almost always going to be someone senior to you. It could be a peer, but more likely it's someone senior. And I think there's two pieces to that question. One is, how do you talk to the more senior lawyer about how the micromanagement is having a negative influence on the work product? Saying, hey, I really feel as though, it's going to be helpful for me if I can do a full draft, and then we can sit down and I can get all of your comments at once. That might be the best use of both of our time. So maybe you turn it around the point of how can we do this in a time-efficient way. Or if the person is just asking you for something every few minutes, make it a habit to sort of preempt that by saying, how about if I report into you at the end of each day where I stand, so that there's some confidence for the supervisor that you're indeed going to hear about where the work product stands and whether or not you're coming closer to getting it done. But I also heard the second part of that question is, how do I keep from being a micromanager? and that's a really important thing because, as you said, Kathy, everybody's concerned. Every lawyer wants their product to be excellent, and they know that they want to deliver the best possible work they can. And so there's this great nervousness of having to let go of a piece of work. And I think it's really just talking with the associate or the attorney or even the secretary who's doing the work for you and making sure they understand exactly what you need, exactly when you need it, and then also by telling them ahead of time how often you're going to check in so that you're not tempted to email them in serial emails 3 times a day or 5 times a day or 10 times a day trying to find out what's going on, but instead I'm going to talk to you about this each week. We'll have a team meeting, or I'll talk to you at the end of Tuesday in order to find out where you stand. Mike, I'm sure you had to deal with this.
Yeah, and Mike, as you talk about it, I want to tell you that I want to get your thoughts on the second part of that. Well, actually, more than the second part of that person's question, but he says, on the flip side, how best do you communicate if you're supervising or delegating that a seemingly minor issue is in fact very important to get right? So that kind of preempts the thought that somebody's micromanaging if they're telling you something, they know something small or minor, but it's so important to the client or whatever it might be. So could you follow up on what you thought with regard to what Sue said, and also kind of touch on that for us too?
Well, we addressed the part about avoiding becoming a micromanager. It just is not the thing to do in the long term. It's not the thing to do that promotes a sense of responsibility for the supervised person. Unless the person is just incompetent, most people want to have responsibility. They want to do it themselves. I agree. Everybody's worried to be sure the work product is perfect and done yesterday and all that sort of thing. So it comes back to what we talked about earlier in terms of setting expectations, clear delegation, clear divisions of responsibility, and setting up in advance some checkpoints so that you don't end up micromanaging. And I'm sorry, Kathy, what was the rest of it?
Well, no, just if you had any thoughts with regard to what Sue was asking, and I think we've well covered that, but I think there's another thing people can do if you aren't exactly comfortable with letting go as a supervisor, or if as a supervisee or delegatee, you're finding that you're kind of being micromanaged. One thing is to, unless you're solo or in a tiny workplace, there are other people who've probably worked with these supervisors and these people doing the work before, and to get some input on how do you find it best to make sure that I know that she's doing the assignment because she doesn't touch base with me, so how do you handle that? Or talk to me about everybody seems so much to want to work with you. Let's talk about how you delegate or what you do for checkpoints and supervision, so you can learn from other folks too. Sue has an article we put up about the art of motivating others, and that's a very thoughtful article. But you don't have to be in a vacuum to learn some of these both tenets and then to practice them, because that's really part of the issue. And I think we've talked a little bit, yes, people are always going to be, some people will be more junior than you, some more senior than you, but, it's really taking an individual approach to working with others. And I think, though, Mike, you had a point you made to us before, we did the program, which I thought was so interesting, about a culture that helps, sort of the whole supervision process along. So that kind of takes it to a sort of bigger picture thought. Do you remember what you told me about that?
Well, there's another component here, I think, which is to whether it's just two lawyers or a lawyer and an administrative person or in a larger organization, to have a culture that encourages the communication about mistakes, encourages understanding of mistakes. There's so many cultures in which junior lawyers in particular are fearful of making a mistake, and so they don't tell the supervisor, and then the problem is compounded because it's discovered later. And it's not easy, but there are going to be mistakes. And if everybody's in fear of making mistakes, that's going to be a poor environment for getting the best results. Not only should there be an open door, not only should there be clear times of communication, but an understanding that people make mistakes. I know I made them, and I heard about them. Let me go back, Kathy, and make just one other point about the prior thing, which is to approach, if you're being micromanaged, an approach is to find somebody else in the organization that might be helpful. But if you have to do it directly, start with questions about why is it that we're doing it this way, and that may encourage a constructive conversation.
That's such a good point. Sue, did you have a quick thought on that?
Yeah, I think that having a culture where the actual quality of supervision is valued is really important. I mean, I think organizations and firms and companies, legal offices can increase their employee satisfaction by making sure that supervisors have access to policies and checklists and resources to help them become better supervisors, so that they understand that is one of the important parts of their job. I think it's one of the core skills is listening, for example. I mean, when Mike's talking about people needing to keep an open door so that people, when they do make the inevitable mistake, will come to the supervisor and tell them about it. You can't deal with something that you don't know has happened. And if there's a culture of fear, it's very likely that you've opened yourself up to risk.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of our listeners was really right on this, and she said if a manager is quick-tempered or focused on negative feedback, employees will only do what they are told to avoid the risk of the repercussion. And I think so. You do have to kind of realize that it's a two-way street in terms of why people who work for you may be giving you the kind of work they do or acting in the ways that they do. Someone said, how do you sort of prevent it without being micromanaging if the people aren't giving you work in a timely way? Well, maybe it's a matter of getting more, Sue said, checkpoints and being clear about when it's due. And, there are, ways that kind of blend over into HR issues. If a person is continually, disappointing you, that's, another sort of topic for another day. But I think somebody asked, and then I want to quickly go on to, we've got some quick tips that are also instructive on some of these questions that we've gotten. But somebody asked, what are the symptoms of micromanagement? This person heavily edits an associate's work, but she thinks that's helpful. But then she said, is that micromanaging? So what do you think on that?
No.
Well, go ahead, Mike.
No. In my context, both, particularly in the law firm, and particularly in the early years, I was subjected to heavy editing, and I in turn did heavy editing. I don't consider that really micromanaging. Sue?
Well, I do think there's a point at which you ask yourself a style versus substance question. Is there, unless your firm has an agreed upon style, or your practice group or your legal office has an agreed upon style of how you write a brief or how you draft an agreement, then as people get more experience, they may decide to employ their own particular style. I think there's, it's part of the growth pattern again. You can see I keep harping on the the developmental value of supervision, that there's an opportunity to help people develop their own style, to help them use their own writing approach and understanding well. But obviously, if there are substantive issues, then that requires a lot of redlining. But I do think that you can waste a lot of time wordsmithing a document that was perfectly fine the way it was the first time. And it's just a matter of becoming comfortable with making sure you're getting the client the best value for the least amount of time. You're giving them a superior product with an efficient time frame. And to do that, maybe you accept that there are stylistic differences, but never give on the substance piece. The substance has to be right.
Okay, let's move on to our quick tips, because Sue, your first one about seeing supervision as a teaching opportunity really sort of speaks to two different questions we've gotten. So if you could quickly sort of take that tip and relate it to these things as well, which is if someone's resistant to being supervised, is there something you can do as you supervise, taking it as a teaching opportunity, as to sort of how to better interact and be supervised and take direction and whatnot? And on the other end of the spectrum, someone said, if you identify someone as superior, who has superior potential, how do you support their growth toward additional responsibilities? And how do you do that? My question is through your supervisory interactions, using this as a teaching opportunity. Can you quickly kind of elaborate, and then we go on to Mike's first tip?
I think on the first part of your question, it's to go to the heart of, I think one of the questioners that we didn't quite answer was the person who said, what if it's a simple little thing that you want them to do differently, but it really is important? I mean, it seems like a small thing, but at the end of the day, it's important. Those are some of the best teaching moments you can possibly have. So that the junior lawyer may be listening to what you're saying, or even a staff member may listen to what you're saying and think, wow, that's just such a nitpicky thing for you to change. But that's when you have to go the extra mile and explain, but here's why we do that. Here's a time that I didn't do that, and here's what happened. Or, here's what our client particularly has asked us to do when we draft this kind of a document, or whatever it may be. Those are really critical opportunities to teach them some of the nuances that they can't perceive because they haven't done this 100 times the way the more senior lawyer has. At the other end of the spectrum, when you've got somebody who's just hugely talented and has great potential, supervision gives you the opportunity to give them gifts. And the gifts are opportunities to work autonomously, opportunities to do more client-facing work, or to do bigger projects, or take responsibility for big portions of a matter or the matter itself. The opportunity to supervise more junior people, staff members and junior lawyers. It really gives you an opportunity to take things that you would normally have done and push it down to them, giving you a growth opportunity. So you have the opportunity then to either improve your team leadership skills or to reach out for even higher and more complex and strategic work.
That's great. Mike, your little tip, your first one is to give ownership and impart trust to the people you supervise. That's kind of the opposite maybe of the micromanagement. Do you have anything you want to add to what we've talked about there?
Well, I think Sue covered it a moment ago pretty well. If you give people the sense that they're doing it well, if you let them deal with the client directly, let them travel on their own to whatever is going on. I used to call it the long leash. And just make sure that they know you're there and that you can help when they need it. I think you'll generate the best work product and the best morale by imparting that trust and that ownership.
Well, what if somebody, here's a question that leads into that, what if somebody on your team is sort of undermining sort of the team dynamics and motivation, even though you've given the ownership and imparted trust and you're working hard, but what if somebody on the team on a team meeting that you're delegating things or whatever is either hostile or undermining? What do you do about that?
Well, yeah, I tend to raise my voice.
Authority, huh? Yeah.
Well, main advice I guess I'd have is whatever sort of communications need to be private. I've had an experience once where a supervisor criticized it in front of others, and I think that's a big mistake. I think it needs to be done in private. And again, I think for the supervisor, starting with a question, why is it that you're doing this, as opposed to immediately condemning the conduct. What is it, and then explain again the context and why, whatever it is, just doesn't fit.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of fits into Sue's next tip in a way with this other question, which was, what do you do if you give ownership to the team and then people don't communicate back when there are issues or problems? Sue, you talk about course correcting. Can you elaborate that a little bit?
Well, you can be a hands-off supervisor, but you have to be ready to swoop back in. And I think I like the concept of course correction because it means that you didn't let it get all the way to the end and have a failure. So you're intervening as soon as you see that a task is going off course, that someone seems to be lagging behind a deadline, or someone is giving you drafts that don't seem to be on point. Intervene as quickly as you can, because the more quickly you can get them feedback, the more able they will be to fix what they're doing and learn from that experience to then continue to work more efficiently as you go forward. I think too often we sort of sit back and wait and see, or be too hands-off in supervision so that we're not even connecting with the person during the project, and then all of a sudden the project is done and it's wrong, or you took too much time, or it isn't what the client needed. I mean, I think those are, being an actively involved and engaged supervisor is different from being a micromanager. It's, keeping track of the matter, keeping track of your delegatees, and really making sure that they stay on course.
Okay, great. Final tip there, Mike. Remember to share strategic and substantive advice. Tell us what quickly you mean by that.
Well, most of my experience was in the transaction context, although as general counsel I had overall responsibility for all of our disputes. But in each case, having the supervised people understand not just, it's litigation and the various steps in litigation or the various pieces of the agreement and that sort of thing, but what is the client looking for here? How does the transaction fit in? Where's the value? With respect to disputes, what are the non-legal consequences? What's the client's risk tolerance? For deals, where are the deal breakers? The supervised person will feel so much better about his or her role and be much more likely to produce a work product that's better because he or she understands how he or she is serving the client as opposed to just doing some job.
Okay, I think that has covered a lot of ground, but let's transition on to our agree disagree moments. We like those. Let me throw the first one out to you, Mike. If we've talked a little bit about mistakes and sort of how supervisors try to create a relationship, trust, etc. Do you agree or disagree? Taking responsibility for the mistakes of your supervisees will impede their growth?
Well, I guess I disagree. As a supervised person, I made mistakes. Don't tell anybody. And people I supervise make mistakes. So as a supervisor, if you think back to when you made mistakes, didn't you appreciate it when your supervisor took responsibility, didn't dump the whole thing in your lap? I think that generates a very positive feeling, at least it should, and again, creates the potential for real long-term benefit in terms of how that supervised person is going to grow and do better and better each time, not make the same mistake again. I think ultimately, when I was a partner or general counsel, if things go badly, it's my problem. Now, I'll have to deal with the junior lawyers or the administrative people and their problems, but it doesn't really do any good for me to try to shift the blame to them. And I think it helps, creates loyalty, better quality and productivity in the long run to take responsibility as the supervisor.
So you can still be teaching and supporting and yet be part of the, as team leader, part of the team that's, everyone's responsible. People, because I know people sometimes want to point the finger at their assistant or secretary, that they could have checked their work more closely before it went out. But, I do think that, throwing people under the bus is what it feels like to people, and that never helps. But here's a corollary for you, Sue. Do you agree or disagree? I think you mentioned something about being positive, but do you agree or disagree that you don't obscure feedback by cushioning it with praise?
Well, I'd have to say I disagree with that, and that's because I think praise has the greatest value in changing behavior. And that's actually been proven in research, that people will work very hard to repeat behaviors that had a positive outcome. So if you tell someone that the reason that you enjoy working with them is because they're so organized and they always have, stay on or ahead of timeline, that person's going to try that much harder to stay on that, to continue to exhibit those behaviors when they work with you in the future. Often what we do with criticism is we try to avoid. It's something that makes us kind of a fight or flight response. And when we get criticism, sometimes if it's handled really well and it's specific and it's timely and it's fair, then we're able to hear it. But it doesn't always result in behavior change, because sometimes we just say, I don't want to work with that person again because they don't like my work, or they don't like the way I write, or they don't think I'm good. Or we may just say, I don't really know how to change. This person said that I didn't do a good job, but they didn't tell me why. So I can't really do any better. I think what you're going to find is that praise needs to be balanced with criticism and developmental comments.
Maybe can you give us an example of how that praise, mixes in with constructive feedback while you're supervising? Can you maybe just sort of wordsmith that for us a little bit as an example?
Well, I think it's really helpful for people to know what they did well as what they didn't do well, and to understand what they could do differently next time. So I think it's kind of thinking about it that way. So you want to be able to thank them for doing, for some aspect of value that they added to the project, whether it was a particular approach to work, or whether it was the timeliness or the extent to which they kept you informed. Then also tell them, where you think on future assignments they can make improvements. In the future I'm going to want you to have, a written agenda for all of our phone calls. Or in the future, I think it would help us to work together better if we communicated more frequently and in person rather than by email. And then, you sort of add the developmental piece in there and say, I think this is, I think there's a lot of things we can work on together, and I really look forward to working with you in the future. I, could see us, working on a project that would allow you to take a much bigger role, or that would allow you to really use, your excellent oral communication skills, whatever it might be. But to make sure that you're giving them messages that help them understand how to direct their developmental focus. And maybe seek out training, or maybe seek out other assignments that will help them, continue to grow and develop. Well,
that leads me, I think that was really helpful. But Mike, that somebody asked us a question that I want to ask you about in there. And they said if the supervisor should they also step in as a mentor, and the way Sue's being sort of encouraging to the person, should they sort of see that also as mentoring, or should just mentors really kind of mentor people that aren't their direct reports?
Oh, well, that's a good question, Kathy. I think supervisors should think of themselves as mentors. Now, there are occasions maybe when some project or task is so minor and it's not going to recur, but thinking of oneself as a mentor, I think, is likely to lead the supervisor to take some more time and effort to enhance the supervised person's professional development. I had 2 mentors at the firm, and they went to a great deal of effort to educate me not only about the law and the practice, but ethics and the business of law. And just to echo Sue's point about praise, I remember one of the lawyers more senior to me came up and said, "Geez, I heard something good about you." That was refreshing. The idea of passing on within an organization, particularly upstream, something positive, because so often in life and the practice of law, we hear from people, our supervisors, our clients, stuff that goes wrong, and I think it makes a big difference to hear something positive. And I guess these are ways of encouraging people to be kind of unselfish in their supervision.
That's interesting. We have a question that I think sort of, I'm not sure I understand it. So let me throw it out to you and see if maybe you do. It says, if praise has the greatest value in changing behavior, should we praise people for meeting our expectations of not making careless errors?
No.
I think you cheapen praise by praising people for doing the minimum, which is to meet your expectations. I think you want, when someone does that, you want to just say, thanks for your effort here. I appreciate the work. That's, you're not thanking them for doing the minimum that you would have expected of, a dedicated lawyer.
And what about sort of the timeline? Somebody asked a question about, what is timely with regard to giving feedback in terms of supervising. It looks like this person might be in a large organization because they ask about, formal performance reviews, but clearly I think we're talking about more often. What would you say about specific feedback? When should it be done? I know everybody's busy, so it's aspirational to say do it quickly during the assignment if you see something go wrong. But how is this in real life? What's like a decent timeline to follow up with or to use?
Well, I think there's two different pieces to this in terms of ongoing feedback versus formal evaluative feedback that's given in an annual or a semi-annual performance review. So ongoing feedback should be given as close to the time that you complete a work assignment as it can possibly be done, so that you can both remember what you did together and both of you have current context for the feedback. And that feedback should be on how you did on that assignment. This is not about whether you're a good or bad lawyer, whether or not you're going to make partner, whether or not you're going to be promoted to, assistant general counsel. That's not what that's about. Your formal performance evaluation is about that progress over time. That's where you're really looking at the whole picture of someone's performance over the course of a whole year, and you're comparing it to previous years so that you're able to say, okay, I've seen growth in your analytical skills. I've seen real growth in your communication skills. I have some concerns about your writing. It's that kind of, you're really looking at a big, broad picture. Feedback, on the other hand, you're just looking at the microcosm of that assignment and that task. And, of course, some longer-term trends may be worth mentioning, like, you did so much better on this project than you did on our last project, or, I'm really seeing improvement in your writing, or, frankly, I was surprised that this project was so offline in terms of time because normally you're so organized. But does that make sense?
Let me just echo that a little bit. If you look at it chronologically from the reverse end, that is the formal feedback, the semi-annual or annual review, I think one of the important points is there shouldn't be any surprises in that. So I think Sue's right.
Right.
You need to give the feedback as promptly as possible in connection with what's just happened or the end of the project, so there are no surprises later on.
And if you've supervised them sort of repeatedly, someone asks what happens when you ask a person to do something differently in the future, but they do not adopt the requested behavior, that's when I think you're saying you can kind of get to a point where you have a conversation, even if you're not in a big organization with formal reviews, where you take a bigger look at a pattern or a situation, and maybe going back to Mike's, ask questions like, why are we sort of not getting there? I think has it been clear about what I want you to do? And if not, ask me questions, and then if there aren't questions, I'm curious about why. And so, you don't jump to I won't work with this person, as Sue said, or you don't necessarily jump to writing them up in an HR thing. There's a lot of room in between. And that's where maybe the mentoring blends. But I thought somebody asked an interesting question just now that I would like to get your thoughts on too, which is how might you adjust your language for the audience, say a student intern versus, an actual lawyer, even if it's a junior lawyer? How do you sort of do this differently or not if it's a student interning with you, summer associate, Thoughts?
Well, that's little plain English would go a long way. As lawyers often get, and in other professions too, using acronyms and shorthands and that kind of thing, and it's difficult. But to try a little plain English.
Well, and I think with students too, you may have to add an extra sentence in there about why it's important when you're giving feedback, so that you're saying that they may not understand why that particular, research was important to you, or how that's going to change your thinking on a case, or how that's going to change the way the client's decision-making process, unwinds. I think with students, because they haven't practiced and they haven't had that much exposure to the application of the law and the problem-solving aspect of the law, I think that's where I've seen, especially with summer associates that I've worked with, that you have this sort of sense of they're really, really smart and they get what they've learned in the law, but they don't really understand the application piece. And so that's where you can have a lot of impact with your feedback by saying, here's why, or here's how we use that.
Let me add something to that, which is when you have someone less experienced, I think it's very important at the outset to say, look, I understand you haven't practiced, and we use a lot of acronyms and terms. You need to be sure to ask when you don't understand, because I think, Stu, it's often typical for a summer intern or a student or someone to be afraid to ask, to think that, geez, if I ask, I'm going to look stupid. And, you need to really encourage the person to ask questions about whether he or she really understands what's going on.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, because students do tend to scare a little bit easily, and rightfully so, because they don't have context and they worry, am I going to be able to be a good lawyer? And so, we talk about praise and constructive feedback, but I think, you want to be very careful even if you see yourself as a very sort of blunt person or whatever, direct, that you not say something sort of off the track there that, projects them thinking, I don't know if I'm going to ever be able to do this. Like, you don't want to say, well, I don't know if good litigators are born or made. I'm not sure, how well you're going to do in this field. There's no need, I think, for that kind of conversation with a student. It's just leaping way too far ahead, and so that kind of leads us to our tips and takeaways, because Mike, I think your first one talks about thinking long term when you delegate and supervise. It's a bit of what I was just saying if you're dealing with a student, but what were you kind of suggesting?
Well, the idea is, in thinking long term, that there's this immediate, sometimes overwhelming concern to get the work done well, get the work done on time. But in the long run, the supervisor really wants the junior person to be building skills and becoming more competent, because that's good for everybody. It's good for the organization. It's good for the individual. It's good for the firm, good for the client. In our organization, our firm, senior lawyers were really pressured to delegate responsibility down. That frees up the supervisor, the partner, the general counsel to take on more strategic responsibility, to do more constructive, big picture thinking for the organization. So, though there's all those immediate concerns about the project, thinking about long-term development of each and every supervised person is, I think, wise in the long run.
Okay, Sue, you have a tip that next, a takeaway I should say, about applying legal project management. That's the acronym LPM, legal project management best practices from delegating to debriefing. I think there's a lot written lately about legal project management, but I'm not sure it's, gone widespread exactly yet. What do you mean by this?
Well, I think it's really important if you tuned into this program because you want to become a better supervisor, you start by stepping back and taking a look at your skills. How well are you doing some of the things that we've talked about, and where could you improve the process? Not just whether you're giving more feedback or whether you're doing a better job of thinking, but how could you think about this in terms of efficiencies of, setting, really outlining assignments and timelines before you ever delegate the assignment, so that you've really thought it through and you really are going to get the person off in the best possible way that they can be successful with the assignment. And then you're setting in periodic checkpoints, so where on that time frame the person should be at any given moment, and you can look at it and say, okay, now I see that you're here, or I see you're behind, or I see you're ahead. Make sure people know when you're giving them feedback. Too many times I'll hear junior lawyers say, well, I don't get any feedback. And then I'll talk to the senior lawyers in that organization, and they'll say, well, I'm giving feedback all the time. But many times the senior lawyer thinks they're giving feedback by redlining a document, or by just giving that person another assignment, meaning that they liked their work. Most junior lawyers need something a little more concrete, so I encourage you to use the words, I'd like to give you feedback. I mean, it sounds silly, but it's actually, at that moment, they kind of sit up and listen and they realize, I'm getting some feedback. Finally, I think in legal project management, one of the things that clients have become particularly interested in is the concept of the debrief at the end of a project. I think if you work with clients over and over and over again, there's an expectation that you're going to be gaining, knowledge management from that continuous work, and it makes you more valuable as a legal service provider, that you're learning from every project you work on for the client. You better understand that client's needs and values. You better understand the competitive environment in which the client works. And so you can understand how to help them make some of the best decisions and how to solve their legal problems. To debrief after every project allows you to say, what did we do well? What could we have done differently? How could we have saved time? How could we have gotten a better result? That kind of thinking for the people who are working on a project pushes you to innovate, to come up with better ideas, but also to make sure that you're improving performance where you possibly can.
That kind of feeds into a question someone asked, which if I did hint at this, I didn't mean to. Person says, I'm interested to hear the implicit suggestion that formal reviews might only be done at a large organization. Is that the best practice, or should annual reviews be done as a matter of course? And I think, we think that, if you have the resources and can do annual reviews or semi-annual reviews, that's wonderful, no matter what the size or type of organization you're in. But that doesn't take away from Sue's point here about debriefing cases and matters, and Mike's point about no surprises. Kind of they all go together. There's sort of this short-term, mid-term, and long-term timeline that Mike and Sue have talked about, it's really a continuum along the spectrum. Mike, somebody asked about sort of when you weigh the positive and the negative feedback, suggesting that the best approach is to give praise. I think Sue mentioned this, then some concrete suggestions and then praise again. And this person says that that puts the focus on the error but encourages the correction. The brief looks good. The research needs more depth and detail. The arguments support the conclusion well. That kind of thing. I know sometimes I've heard associates don't like that. Junior lawyers don't like that because they feel like, okay, I'm getting praise, but I know what's really coming here. They kind of have a reference, they call that. I can't say it on the call, some sort of sandwich with something in the middle that you don't really like. But, I mean, this kind of leads into your next tip about permitting discussion and disagreement as you supervise, right? I mean, talk to us about that.
Well, let me first answer the question about annual reviews. I think they're critical, and you got to do it because if it's positive, it's helpful. If it's negative and you don't do it, you're going to have a difficult time getting rid of the person. But Kathy, the point about how to give the praise and the negative, and if you do it in what seems like a formulaic way, it's not going to come across well. I think it just needs to be a genuine discussion, a genuine talk about, and maybe it's over drinks, maybe it's over lunch. Some people are shy and some people aren't about discussion and disagreement. Again, the way the supervisor might approach this is, rather than just launching into a critique, is to ask the supervised person, well, what do you think happened here? What do you think the high points or the successes were? What do you think some of the mistakes were, and what should we do about them? To generate a genuine discussion. You might learn something. There might be better ways to do things. And these days, the way people are practicing, the way they're communicating through email and long distance and texting and that sort of thing, I think it may be more difficult to have clear communications. It reminds me of that Paul Newman movie, Cool Hand Luke. You have a failure to communicate. And that can be true in terms of the delegation, the supervision, and what we're talking about most recently, which is feedback. You alluded to it earlier. People feel like they haven't gotten any because there was a failure to communicate.
Okay. I think maybe if you're at a distance too, maybe it'll help video conferencing and Skype and FaceTime, at least some of the time. So there are these visuals when you're not face-to-face can maybe make for fuller communication. And Sue, I think that brings us, you had some suggestion about a technology that you told me about that I wasn't aware about, and then you have a final quick takeaway.
Well, there's technology called SharePoint that allows you to have, share communications on a task, particularly if on an ongoing matter that would help you. And there's other, electronic tools that let you see shared documents, and maybe even you may have a portal that allows the client to view those same documents. And some of those permit for good opportunities to give feedback or good opportunities for you to be communicating on a more regular basis without actually having to take more time to send someone a document to look at or have them in a meeting.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So your final takeaway there.
Well, my final takeaway is really that great supervision takes a lot of time. And what you get in return is better work product, more opportunities for you to do higher level work, and a motivated workforce. I think that when you think about the different tools you can use to be more efficient, you're also going to see that many of those things lead you to the tools that will help you be more effective. So I That's my brief takeaway.
Okay, great. And to encourage people to sort of know how to best work with you to, help them know when to get a hold of you and or pop in on you, or how do you want an email, or, so that in a bad moment, and we all have them, we don't break all this trust after all the hard work we put into supervision. I think all in all what that says to me is that one of the things you need to concern yourself with as a supervisor is the reputation you have for being a good supervisor. And that really leads us to next month's program, which is about strategically building your reputation, both within your office and beyond. And so I hope you like these programs. You'll come, into that and the ones thereafter. You can go ahead actually on www.ambar.org/advice and even register for the upcoming programs. And all that said, we like to leave you with things. Sue had a very good little quick article, Top 10 Tips in Supervising in a Law Practice Management Context. So we leave you with thoughts, and we hope you enjoyed today's faculty. I want to thank Mike and Sue profusely. And on behalf of the ABA, we thank our audience and ask you to stay on quickly just to fill in the evaluation, give us some thoughts going forward of what we can do differently, topics you'd like to see, and we say thank you very much.